Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm so very happy to be here with Julio Padovan, and he'll be speaking with us from New York City. And he will be talking about escape mechanisms of the ego, as you can see on the screen. This is part of our series, Seeds of Knowledge. And while I'm really happy to be here with Julio, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce this live lecture from the Solitude Center for Spiritual Living to you. Who are we? We are an organization relatively new. We are 1.5 year old. Uh, we are an organization that our studies are done 100% virtually with founding members from many different places of the world. Currently, we have workers and members from Brazil, Asia, Europe, and the US presently. What do? We present lectures like this one, study groups, as well as do an interesting study or work on those things that we need to console ourselves, being messages or conversations. Our our work is largely through the mentorship of Joanna DeAngelis, our spiritual mentor, and it's based on the vast literature of Spiritism. But today I want to stop talking and want to introduce Julio Padovan. For those who do not know him, Julio Padovan, he is a Brazilian national and he's been working as a full-time researcher at the Rockefeller University since 1996. Mr. Padovan is an adjunct associate professor at the Department of Chemistry at York College in New York City. He holds several academic degrees, and he's a lecturer for both the physical sciences as today with us with Spiritism. Julio was first introduced to Spiritism when he was only 15 years old, and since then he's interested in studying, but also making the linkage between that solid logic foundation upon which Spiritism is based on. But with that, Julio, I'm going to go in the backstage, and I hope that this is a wonderful time with you. And we'll be back if we have questions and answers. Thank you so much, Julio. Please, everyone, feel free to write your questions in the chat, and we'll address them at the end.
So hello everyone, and thank you for having me here. Thank you, Marcia, for this introduction. Today, we will be talking about escape mechanisms of the ego, and it's a very interesting topic from the point of view that we all are related to it. The ego is in every one of us, as we'll see in a minute, and I would appreciate your comments or your questions at the very end. I welcome all of you, brothers and sisters from this plane of existence and from the spiritual realm as well, who are probably watching in every home, in every place where we here, the reincarnated beings, are watching as well. So, what is this lecture about? So, just to go very quickly through the contents, we have 7 parts, and we're going to have a brief discussion about words and nomenclature. We're going to look at the Freudian psychoanalytical model of the human personality, but in very simple terms. You don't have to be scared already from this point. It's going to be very simple with words that we all can understand. Then going to look at the ego a little bit more in detail, and we're going to look at the escape mechanisms. What is it that the ego does that it eventually prevents us from moving forward, and how we can adjust that? And that's part 6, the adjustment. And the last part I have is a discussion. So it's going to be based on your questions or your comments. That's all. It's a little bit of a long lecture. It's unusually longer than the other ones that you probably have watched in this channel. But you will see in a minute that is very difficult to break it apart, to break it into pieces. And I hope that you will stay with us till the very end. So, having said all that, let us start by defining terms because this is very important. Words are actually the clothing of our thoughts. And if they are not expressed properly, these words, it means that our thoughts are also muddled. So, the very first thing is that unfortunately, our vocabulary, our languages, they are always growing. It's an ongoing process. So eventually, we find what's called a lexicographic clash. In other words, what is that? It's when two words that mean things that are completely different become or are written in the same way. Or when we actually give the one word that from the very beginning with the same root to two different meanings, or we give two different meanings to the same word. So, without going too much in detail about that, these are some of them: the ego, the self, and the I. So, we know the I as the pronoun, as I am speaking at the moment, right? So, that is one meaning, to represent a person, the first person singular form. But then there is the I that we are going to see here that is more related to the personality, what is inside of us, and what is actually referred to sometimes by inner I or deeper I or the self. This is a part that is very complicated for us to understand. Psychologists, psychiatrists take this on their stride because they are used to this, but not for most of us. So there is a lot of that there's a considerable number of texts where you see inner eye, deeper eye. Well, that means what is the essence in all of us. It is not the perispirit, it's not the spirit, and it's not the physical body either. It is the essence. That part in us that is non-material and non-physical. So as you see, we have a bit of a problem. But then, in order for us to address this issue and do it in a constructive way, I want you to pay attention to what I just did here on the screen. If you look to your left, you'll see that the words are capitalized: ego, self, and I. If you look on the right side of your screen, in red, you'll see ego, self, and I as in lowercase, except the I, because grammatically in English we have to capitalize the first singular form of the pronoun. So this is for us to understand better the context and to discriminate what we are talking about when we say ego with capital E and ego with lowercase e. I call the ones on the left side of the screen the Angelesian meaning of the words in honor to our benefactress, Joanna de Angelis. I don't say this lightly or without respect, quite the opposite. It's almost as if she has created a language of her own. She has not, that was not the intention, but it's important that we see this difference. So every time I refer to a word with a capital letter, it is in this Joanna de Angelis context or the Angelesian context. We are also going to see another word that is not here, which is reality. So every time I refer to reality with a capital R at the beginning, it means the true reality, whatever it is. It's the reality from the creation. It's the reality of the divine, the reality from God. So if we don't know what that reality is, but we know it exists, or at least we have faith that it exists. It is actually a point of faith. It's an article of faith for us. So the reality with capital R is that representation. The reality that we think is there, the reality we interact with, our reality is going to be represented with a lowercase r. And that's to distinguish so that we don't get things confused. So it's the same thing as when we say love. There is the love that is more related to desire, to even lust, or to sexual practice. That is lowercase l. When we refer to the universal love, the divine love, that is going to be with a capital L. So, in essence, what we have here, everything that is capitalized, at least the first letter is capitalized, it is coming from the spiritual realm. It has this very broad, very moral sense, even in some cases. And everything that is non-capitalized is what we perceive, is what we interact with, is our interaction with the real reality, or the reality with a capital R. And having put all that, we now have to work a little bit more on some words, such as das es, das ich, and das über ich. And what are they? This is not a German class. This is not even a German lecture, because I don't speak German. Okay? So this is what Freud actually used to call certain parts of our psyche. Now, the first thing we need to understand is that he spoke German. So he spoke German and he used these words to exemplify, or to denote, I should say, certain parts of our mind, of his model. And das es means the it, das ich is the I, and das über ich is the beyond the I. Unfortunately, when Freud's works were translated, they were translated by a couple, James and Alex Strachey. So the Strachey's decided at the time, there was a very intense current among linguists to bring Latin into the English language. So they did not want the it, the I, and the beyond the I. So they decided to, let's say, make it a little more sophisticated. And they were the ones that were responsible for going with the id, the ego, and the superego. This created a huge amount of confusion, has been in that situation since then, since the translation, because we have a word for ego, we have a meaning for ego, and this meaning normally is when someone, for instance, is very selfish. You would say, oh, that person has such an ego. When that person comes into the room, nobody can breathe because that individual takes all the air from the room just for himself or herself. Well, that is usually the word ego used in everyday language, with the idea of selfishness, with the idea of self-centeredness, even if it's not malicious. Self-centeredness is the idea of an individual who never thinks of the others. This was not what Freud meant by das Ich. But das Ich was actually something that meant related to us, but not only us, not only myself. It doesn't have any negative connotation. But unfortunately, because of the translation and the use of a word ego, it got all of this confusion. Notice that in English, we say the id, the ego, the id, the ego, the superego. It's not superego, ego, id. There is an article in front of it. This article is mandatory to make it different, especially the ego, to make it different from that ego of self-centeredness, of selfishness, and so on and so forth. The same thing applies for id. It has nothing to do with identification. It has nothing to do with identification. It's Latin. And in this particular case, it did mean that it was something there. Something, just like it in the original sense. So all of this is important. because otherwise we look at the model that Freud developed with already a bias, with a prejudice. Whenever we see the word ego, oh my goodness, this is bad. No, it's not bad. It is not bad. It is neutral. It's a part of our evolutionary process and a part we cannot live without. So we have to recalibrate our brains to accept that. Otherwise, when we hear things about the Freudian model, when we read it from Joanna de Angelis or any other author, spiritual or not, we are going to get very confused because we go in already extremely biased. So, what is this model? The very first thing that I want to say to you is that it is a model. A model is something that we do in order to understand something. It does not mean, for instance, that whatever we are studying is exactly the model. The model is always an ongoing process. The model is like a box where we start putting things inside. The things that we put inside are the information that we gather from our object of study, from what we are studying. The model should be adaptive. So the more adaptive a model is, it's as if the box could get bigger and bigger and bigger, so we can always put more things inside. If we make our model very rigid, there will be a point where we will not be able to put anything inside anymore. And that's when we have to toss the model and get a new one. The model is no longer possible. The model is no longer viable. Okay? But it's still a model. If the model meant to be exactly what we are studying, we wouldn't call it a model. We would call it by the name of what we are studying. So if I'm studying a beach ball, the model would not be called the model of a beach ball. It would be called beach ball if one was exactly the same as the other. As a model, it means necessarily, implicitly, that I do not know everything there is to know about the object of study. So I create what is a representation of that object. And as a representation, I may call parts of it, I may divide it into parts, I may call the different parts different names. I can do anything with my model, but I have to be very careful not to confuse the model with the real object in front of us. When we speak of the human personality, is one thing. When we speak of the psychoanalytical model of the human personality, in this case Freud's, it's another. One is the real thing, the object of study, the human personality. And the other, the model of the human personality, is actually just that, the model. So if I now in my model have divisions, it does not mean necessarily that the human personality is divided as such. It just means that I'm using my namesake's strategy, Julius Caesar's divide and conquer, famous divide and conquer, so that we have a problem that is big, we divide into smaller pieces, and then we look at each one of the pieces, and then we try to reassemble the pieces to see if we can get the whole, because it's easier that way. And we do this on an everyday basis without even knowing it. All right? So having said all this, and you will see why it's important, we are now going to see that Freud divided this model of the human personality into three parts. The id, das es, or it, the I, or ego, das ich, and the superego, or das Überich, the beyond the ego. Überich is not super. There's nothing super about it. This is not Superman's ego. This is not a superwoman's ego. This is actually another problem with the translation. It's not really super. Is über in German is very flexible. And in this case, what Freud truly meant was beyond, what is one step over, one step more after the I or the ego. And it got translated to superego because probably it was shorter and it was easier to say it. But the truth is, it should be the beyond the ego. That part in us that goes after the I, beyond the I. And you will see why this is so important. Because each one of these three compartments, and here I want to say one thing that is important, they do not exist. They are pieces of the model. Our human personality is the whole. Freud created these divisions to express himself, to attack the problem more efficiently, to address the issues more efficiently. So do not confuse id, ego, superego as pieces of ourselves. They are not pieces of our human personality. They are ways to deal with our personality, to speak about or to speak of our personality. So when Freud divided these three, he gave certain roles to each one of these three. And this is very important for us because we are going to be talking about the ego part specifically in this talk. Now, with this, and this is a picture of an iceberg, you will see very quickly that the iceberg has the bulk of it underwater, and there's just a little bit over the line of water. Now, the ego, you see, goes all the way from below the water to the part that is above it. So does the superego. But the id is completely submerged. Not only submerged, but the id is very deep down into this picture of an iceberg. And this is a beautiful picture. Whoever came up with it really got the idea about ego, id, and superego because got just about right. And this picture also allows us to talk about the conscious, the semi-conscious, and the unconscious, which is important, especially when we study mediumship. So the conscious part of our mind, and again, I repeat myself here, the mind has no three parts. We divide the mind in our model in three parts, again, to work with the issues or to work with the mind to understand it and to be able to relate to it and express ourselves better. Not that the mind itself has three pieces. Okay, there's no delimiting line from one to the next. So the conscious part of our mind is everything that is above the surface. And above the surface is what we have on our daily lives, is how we interact with the world, and it's what we call awareness. I am aware that I'm talking at the moment. You are aware that you're sitting down watching this lecture. This awareness is the conscious part of our mind. And in this diagram is everything that is above the water, floating in the air. It doesn't matter. Everything that is above the water line. Anything that is immediately below the water line, in shallow waters, is what we call the semi-conscious. And you can watch there in the animation. I have it, lined so that you can see. And anything that is below the semi-conscious and all the way deep into the ocean in this picture, it is called the unconscious mind. And like I said, this is important in mediumship because we speak of mediumship being conscious, semi-conscious, or unconscious, or the level of consciousness or the level of the trance one goes in. So in order actually to produce the mediumistic phenomenon. So this is to give you an idea. So the more aware we are, the closer we are to the conscious part of our mind. The less aware we are, the more towards the unconscious part of our mind. Here, it is the same thing as with the ego, id, and superego. The conscious, the semi-conscious, the unconscious, not just conscious, unconscious, because these are nouns, and they are nouns that describe a part of a whole. So in order not to say of the mind, we just say the conscious. When we say the conscious, we don't need to say of the mind. It already is implied by the article. You may think that these are just being picky. It's not about that, because when you read, especially Joanna de Angelis, she's very good in her grammar. If you are not paying attention to these little subtleties, you get 6 for any other number that is not 6. And we want to get 6 for half a dozen, but not any other number. We want to get the right meaning that she wanted to convey. So we must pay attention to these subtleties. Since we are not trained as psychiatrists, since most of us are not trained as psychologists, as therapists, we must be even doubly careful and cautious about these things. Otherwise, we end up ascribing or giving a meaning to a word that is not what was intended by the author. This is not the author's fault. This is not the translator's fault. When it's translated properly, if we are not reading it carefully, then it's on our side. If the author actually wrote a beautiful text, again, it's on our side. So all of these things are important. Don't forget that. So having spoken of the 3 parts of the mind, conscious, semi-conscious, unconscious, having spoken of the 3 parts of the human personality, which is a model from Freud, the id, ego, superego, we now can look a little bit more and try to understand why we are going to focus on the ego. But just before we do that, what is the id? The id is actually the most instinctive, the primordial, the primeval in us. The id is the one that doesn't know that there are other people around. If you had to ascribe selfishness or self-centeredness to any one of these, it would be the id. The id doesn't even know. It's not that it doesn't notice or doesn't care about others. The id is not even aware of others. The id is the instinct in us. I'm going to give you an example. If you live with someone, let's say you have a roommate, you're living in a fraternity or sorority house, and you have roommates, right? And one day you arrive and you're alone in this said house, and there is a cake cooling off in the kitchen. The id is the one that says, I want the cake. I want to pig out on that cake. I want the whole cake. That's what the id says. The id doesn't even say to you or is related to something like, oh, is the cake mine? Do I have the right to eat the? No, that doesn't even come into debate. The id only says, I want that cake. It's the instinctive in us. Perhaps I'm hungry, or perhaps I'm just very selfish, or it doesn't matter. I want the cake. That's the id. The ego, notice that in this diagram, which is now the part that is circled in red, the ego is much closer to the line of the water and even above it. So the ego is now beginning to be aware of the presence of others. But the ego still looks at everything based on its innermost feelings, or not innermost feelings, but towards itself. What the ego will do in this example of the cake is the following. Maybe I should not eat the whole cake. Not because there are other people or because the cake is not mine. The ego doesn't consider that. The ego considers the following. Maybe if I eat the whole cake, I will get sick. Maybe if I eat the whole cake, I'll have to go to the gym every single day for the next month. The ego doesn't consider other people's feelings, other people's rights, doesn't consider if I have the right to eat the cake. The ego is preoccupied, concerned with itself, with the being itself. If I eat the cake, the whole cake, will I not get sick? So this is what we have. Now, after the ego, we have the superego. And you notice that the superego goes from all the way from above the waterline to the bottom, all the way deep down. How is this possible? Well, the superego is the part of ourselves that relates to others, relates to the environment around us. And every time I speak of environment here, surroundings, I'm not talking about in the ecological sense. if we know we are planting a tree or not. I'm talking about everything that is around, period. As simple as that. What is around can be people, can be trees, can be objects, inanimate objects. It doesn't matter. Okay? It's what is around. So the superego is our interaction with what is around, with our surroundings, with the environment. The superego, in the example of the cake and eating it or not, is the part in us that, once developed, will ask the following question: do I have the right to eat the cake? It's not mine. Should I not ask permission? Will I be depriving my roommates of a slice of the cake if I eat the whole thing? So the superego is beginning to think and to, well, first of all, to observe that there are other things, that there is a surrounding, that there's a surroundings, there is an environment around ourselves. And what is our relation to that environment? It is very important that we understand that id, ego, superego are not mean or selfish or self-centered. There's nothing like that. The id is simply not aware of the environment, period. The ego is aware only of the internal environment. Internal meaning everything inside of ourselves. This should not be confused with self-centeredness or with selfishness. And here's where ego with capital E is different than that ego we speak on our daily lives when we say, oh, that person has such a big ego. That is a way of saying selfish, self-centered. It's not what we are ascribing here. It's not what we are speaking of here. The big ego with the capital E, with the big E, here is neutral. It's a piece of our personality that is simply concerned with the internal environment, the environment of the I. And the superego, same thing. Do not believe that the superego is the moral side, the conscious, the good part, the good guy of this schematics of this iceberg. No, the superego can be the villain as well. The superego is concerned with the environment that is external to the person. That is what we should understand. And now that we have divided all these things, we're going to go back to the ego because this is what it's about. The ego is important for us because it's what extricates us from everybody else. It's what makes us unique individuals. First, there was the id. And no, this is not a romance or a fairy tale story. But first, there is the id, the instinctive. And because that instinctive came from the same set of experiences that was common to everybody, when we were not even spirits, we're monads. We basically have, all of us had, in the end, the same set of experiences. And we built an id that was very primeval, very primitive. As we began to have more and more experiences, and we're going to see this in a bit with more detail, okay? As we experience more and more of the creation in some way or another, we began to develop our own paths. That's when it's the very beginning of the intelligence, is the very beginning of the development of free will, is the very beginning of the development of responsibility, all at the same time in some form of a jumbled and almost confused development. But everything had its place, do not get me wrong. So this is when the ego begins to differentiate us. As we develop it, we begin to be different from others. We now are creating our individuality. And it is the ego that is responsible for it, which is why I want to convey to you, I'm sorry if I apologize if I'm being repetitive, that the ego is not the mean guy, not the villain here. All right? The ego was important in our development. The way we are today is in great part the part that is responsible for what we are today is the ego. So we should be grateful for the development of that ego, that part of our personality, of the human personality. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, or we would be here and we would all look like drones, all with the same face, which is very much like we look when we think about ourselves in the monad stage. All right. It is this ego that now also leads us to the superego, the other part. Now, when we start thinking of beginning, we don't think, we begin to be aware of our external environment. And oops, now that I'm beginning to be aware of my external environment, I see that there are other people. And I begin to look at those people and say, oh, they look like me, they behave like me. So I look and I find similitudes. I find things that are the same, or things that are not identical but very, very much like one another. And I also find the differences. So this is my awareness of what is on the outside myself, not outside the house, but outside myself. And that's now the superego. And it is the superego that is going to be responsible for our ethical side, our moral
Mhm.
side. That is true. Because ethics, because morals is actually our relationship with others, particularly other human beings or animals or the environment, now in the sense of ecology of a plant. Should I damage a tree or not? So it is the superego that is responsible for this interaction. But the same superego can also be less constructive. Let's put it this way. So again, all these three parts of the human personality, these divisions that Freud created, they are neutral. Is what we do with each one of them, or the intended result, or the result itself of an action, of a thought, of oral of speech. It's the intention that eventually classifies them as being constructive or non-constructive. And we should even avoid actually classifying these things as constructive or not. We should just see them as what they are: id, ego, superego, and parts of our human personality that do this or that. In the case now, back to the ego, I said this is our first moment of awareness of ourselves, because it's the internal environment of what we are. And because we are beginning to be aware, that's why part of it is floating above the waterline. All of these are very important. All these little pieces are very important. And as we develop ourselves intellectually, as I mentioned, it is the ego that will create our individualization, or will lead to our individualization. And this individualization is going to be unique because our experiences are also unique. Even though we are all sitting here watching the same lecture, assuming that we can learn something from it, we learn different things because we come in already with different backgrounds. So the way we perceive things from the lecture is different based on our background. So this is the background in us, our atavisms coming in. This is all that we have already been in previous reincarnations, molding, framing, constructing new things now in the current reincarnation, but based on what we had before. We cannot build where there's nothing. We have to first have a foundation. The foundation was laid out when we were monads. Now, as spirits, we're putting the edifice up. We're bringing that building up from that foundation. But then some of us begin from the left side of the edifice, the other ones from the right side, but we all begin from the foundation up. That is one, definitely, that one point that's common to all of us. Now, can the ego lead us to a moral, to an ethical side? Yes. we are going to see that the ego is the part that generates that moral side, which we eventually move into the superego in order to manifest it. But we are going to see that this comes from interacting with the environment, interacting with the reality with a capital R, and in doing so, creating the realities or perceived realities, which is what we perceive of the real thing. And these perceived realities is a reality with a lowercase r. So I said, the ego does this based on experiences. So I made a few animations here for us to understand this a little better. So imagine at the beginning that there is no experience. We have just moved, we are that under that threshold from monad to spirit. We've had experiences as monads, but not experiences as spirits. And now we are going to have experiences. What are these experiences? Anything and everything. Whatever we do, whatever we interact with is an experience. And this is why, if you look to the left side of your screen, slightly towards the upper left corner, you're going to see that I put this very weird shape there to indicate an experience. I did not want to put anything that was a triangle or like a defined geometric figure, because I don't want it to be sidetracked. I want to say it's anything and everything we come into contact with. So right now it's very grayed out because it's to give the idea that we have no experiences. When we have no experiences, we have no ego. Now on the right side of your screen, you have what I'm going to use in this lecture called the ego meter. It's basically just to give an idea how much developed our ego is. Now, be careful. I will repeat myself here. This development of the ego has nothing to do with selfishness. It's how developed we are, and in the same way, how developed our ego has become. Right? So now you notice that I removed the gray, the fuzziness of the experiences, and I put that symbol there, and that symbol in light green to yellow. And then I said the ego has developed a little bit. There is a little bar inside my ego meter. What we are going to see is that as I accumulate experiences, my ego also develops because it learns from these experiences. So I want you to observe this area now that is in yellow, and I'm going to give you an animation to show you in simple terms how this ego is going to develop or become developed, I should say. So let's go. Let us see that as the experiences accumulate, look at what is happening to the ego. It is developing. It's becoming larger and larger, growing, developing further and further, more and more. Now here, of course, I put an end to it, but we are going to develop forever. All right. So I'm going to go back in this presentation, and I want to show you it again. And we are going to start more and more experiences, and more developed the ego becomes. All right. This is important for us because what are these experiences? As I said before, these are anything and everything I interact with. It doesn't matter. It may be all the way from boiling an egg to simply watching the sky, to actually planting a tree, or to talking to someone. It doesn't matter. All of these are experiences. And the ego learns from them, or incorporates them, I should say, and creates from that a process of learning. So we've seen this, experiences. We have information from the environment, from the surroundings. We have a knowledge. The knowledge is the accumulation of information that is now intricately related to one another. Knowledge and information are two different things. Information is a piece it's something. Let's say I give you my phone number. That's a phone number. That's information. When you associate that to my name, when you associate that, if I'm a friend, if I'm a colleague, if I'm a boss, if I am the professor, if I'm this, that, the teacher, if I'm your physiotherapist, that is now a knowledge. You add other pieces of information and you concatenate them into a group of, or a database, or a group of, not a database, but a group of pieces of information that all together have a particular meaning. That's when we move from information to knowledge. And it's the knowledge in sequence that is going to create a behavioral code for ourselves. So let us look here. I presented to you this before. I said when we have many experiences in life, our ego develops and develops it to the full extent. Whatever the full is not important right now. I mentioned to you that we are eternal beings. We are always going to be developing our egos. We are always going to be developing ourselves. Okay? So don't worry about the end. I have to put an end to the ego meter because I don't have an infinite real estate or space on my screen. That's all. Also, remember that the ego meter, that piece in red on the right side of your screen, is not related to selfishness, self-centeredness, but how our ego with a capital E has developed. In this case, I'm not comparing the ego with anything else. So it's an absolute value. That ego is increasing. That's all I need to understand. That when I go from very little ego, the red bar being very small, close to the word ego, and then as it begins to fill that rectangle on the right side of your screen, just means that the ego is developing more and more. But I'm not saying if it's developing more than something else. This is important for us also to understand. How is it that the ego interact with the reality with capital R? It reacts to the reality, interacts with the reality, associates, relates to the reality through a filter. The ego itself, the more developed it is, the clearer the filter. So let us try to understand it this way. Look smack in the center of your screen. There is a filter. It's called a monochromatic filter. The ego, I made the ego being a red filter. So people who like photography, for instance, they will love this example. They will understand it very quickly. Now, on the lower right quadrant of your screen, you have 4 circles. One that is white, one that is yellow, green, and blue, respectively. We are going to see what type of color we get when we move the filter of the ego over each one of these colors. These colors represent experiences in reality with capital R. But when we move our ego over each one, observe the color. White will turn into pink, and then that into orange, this one into brown, and the last one from blue to purple. Once again, see the difference? We have green going to brown and then red going to purple. So the ego filters reality because we don't have all the experiences in the world. We only have a set of experiences. And because we have only a set of experiences, we only see a piece of that reality. Let's go back to the cake. I really like the example of the cake. Imagine, for instance, that I would bake a cake and I would give to you only the frosting. You wouldn't know what the cake tastes like. If I gave you only the dough part of the cake, again, you wouldn't know what the cake tastes like. If I gave you just the filling, same thing. I have to give you a slice that goes all the way from the frosting to the dough, through the dough, and the filling. Otherwise, you will always have only a part of it. You would be able to say, oh, the frosting is very nice. Oh, the dough is a little dry. Or you would say, oh, the filling is very nutty or very fruity. But you wouldn't be able to say how the cake tasted because you never had everything. In order to have everything, to understand the cake, you have to have a slice that goes through all its parts. So the ego in us is that, not bad, not good, simply a filter. In this case, I gave you a filter that is red, just red. So red made the blue and the white into pink, the yellow into orange, and then the green into brown, and then blue into purple. If I had started with a different color for my ego, which would mean a different set of experiences, I would end up with different colors. I just chose this one because it's something that most people can detect without much problem. So we call this a filtering effect. In this case, red filtering, but just a filtering effect. The ego filters reality with capital R, and it creates a perceived reality with lowercase r, my reality, the reality I see. So let us look at this. Imagine that you are this observer number one, and you are actually interacting with your surroundings, but you only have the experiences that are shown all the way on the left side that are in pink over there. So you have not seen all the experiences. That's your perceived reality. You will think that you know everything, but you don't. If you're now observer number two, you will only see these ones that are closer to you on the right side of the experiences set. And then you will only be aware of those. So your perceived reality will be slightly different. You are not aware that there are more experiences to be had, to to interact with. There is no bad or good in this process, no constructive, destructive behavior. It's just the number of experiences you've had. So the ego perceives reality with capital R according to the experiences. And it's these experiences that will contribute to its development. Fortunately for us, at infinity, we will have had all the possible experiences available. So we will have our perceived reality equal the real reality, or the reality with capital R. Real reality, I know it's a very poor construction, but please allow me a little leeway here. I hope you understand, okay, that I meant that as you have all the possible perceived realities in existence, in the creation, you have then constructed your view of all these perceived realities, and that construction will match bit by bit reality with capital R. You will understand the reality that is divine, that is from God and of God. That is the whole point. But we are very far from it. So we muddle through, basically. We go through our perceived realities, and what we do, we have more and more and more experiences trying to fulfill ourselves, to develop ourselves in such a way that we begin to have this more encompassing view of the creation. But there is a little problem. Sometimes, and usually most of the time, we refuse to acknowledge these experiences. We are aware of them. Sometimes we are not aware of them. So when we are unaware of them, that's it. We're just not aware. Like in this example, for instance, in your screen, observer one is completely unaware of the ones in the middle, of the experiences in the middle. Observer number two is also unaware of all the experiences in the middle, plus the ones on the left side. Observer number one is unaware of all the experiences in the middle, at the top, and the ones on the right side. But they can also be aware of the experience and refuse to acknowledge them. When we refuse to acknowledge an experience, it's an escape mechanism in simple terms, right? I ask forgiveness to psychologists, psychiatrists here. I know I am simplifying into some degree the process, but I'm not oversimplifying it. So it is important and to simplify certain things for everyone to be able to access the information. What we have to be very careful is what Einstein once told us. Make it simple, not simpler. So this is what I'm at least trying to do, and I hope I am succeeding. All right. I know that there are intricate processes and details but we should not spend too much time on these details because otherwise we lose the whole. The idea here is to convey the whole. So either we are unaware of experiences to be had, or we are aware that there are experiences to be had, or we have even experienced them, but we refute them. We refuse to acknowledge them. When we refuse to acknowledge them is what we call escape mechanism. And this brings us to escape mechanisms of the ego, which is the bulk of chapter 7 of the book, The Conscientious Being. And this lecture is primarily about that single chapter of the book, The Conscientious Being. There are many other things that I read, of course, in psychology and even in psychiatry a little bit, but more in psychology. But for us, if you want to understand what I'm talking, you want to look at the original text, I suggest you go to chapter 7 of the book, The Conscientious Being, by the Spirit Joana de Angelis, psychographed by Divaldo Pereira Franco. So the escape mechanisms of the ego, as I mentioned, these are forms that the ego manifests. The ego doesn't hold anything. It's not a person. It's not an entity. Remember, the ego is a part of a model. A part of a model doesn't have a life of its own. All right? So these are manifestations of our personality where we create perceived realities and we deny the continuation of our process. Either we deny the experience itself, or we deny having had the experience, or we even deny what that experience can bring to us. One way or another, we are actually stalling our process, our progress, our evolution. When I'm going to say the ego, but when we, because the ego is us, okay? Remember, we are the ones with a human personality. The ego is a construct of that, of the model of our personality. So the ego clings, or we cling to such filtered perspectives, perceived realities that are distorted. What we end up is with that perceived reality in clear defiance to anything that we could have gained if we had had an open mind, we had gone into this process with an open mind. So anything that now comes in to us, in our direction, from any experience with the outside, with the environment, with the surroundings, we simply don't take it, or we distort it. Instead of looking at it from in its raw form, without any bias, any prejudice, we always go in with a red filter. And the red filter ends up being detrimental to our progress. We begin to get attached to our perspectives. Remember when we had that observer 1 and observer 2? It's as if that observer 1 did not want to move to the right side to see and experience other things. And if it's the same thing for observer 2, that wouldn't like to go to the left side to have newer experiences as well. When this attachment is very strong, it ends up being not postponed, but transferred, actually moved from one reincarnation process to another. And this is what we call the negative part of our atavism, or the not negative, but more the less constructive part of atavism. We bring these biases, these prejudices from one reincarnation to the next, and that just keeps, it's like anchoring us to the past and does not allow us to move forward. All right. This is a reiteration of the perceived realities, a component of our atavism, in this case, the less constructive component, because atavism is also neutral. We can also have good components, the constructive components, I should say, not good, but constructive components. And we have many different ways. Joanna de Angelis picked 5, the major ones. Let's see each one of them now. Compensation is the first one. In compensation, we maintain a perceived reality simply by denying the reality with a capital R. We deny what we are looking at, and we distort it according to our filter, our ego. And in doing so, it's not just that we distort it, but now we begin to impose our distorted view on others. This is the part that is important. Not only do I distort what I see, what I experience, what I interact with, but now I want others to be the same as I am, to behave in the same way as I do. I impose that perceived reality, which is only mine, on others. And because perceived realities are individual, the moment that I impose it on other people, the moment that I impose any perceived reality onto others, it is forceful, it is menacing, it is threatening. Depending on the degree of this imposition, okay, it can be harassment. It changes the whole interaction with other individuals. But the point is, I do impose it to some extent that sometimes it can become intense, relentless, and it is actually a form of rebelliousness. There are many ways we can do this, but we can draw in this case a chain of events. I have a conflict that is established between my ego that has been developed to a certain degree and my unwillingness to accept a new information. This is very common when we get these people that say, "Oh, I'm too old. I cannot learn anything. Old dogs cannot learn new tricks." So people who believe in the old saying, old dogs cannot learn new tricks, are right there in this category. For instance, they are prone. It's not that they will have compensation mechanisms, but they are very much prone, and more prone even, I should say, to developing compensation mechanisms, because they are unwilling to accept new information. They are unwilling to revise their perspectives. So that's what happens at the first. This conflict is then filtered by the conscience. So now the ego and what is experienced from the outside goes into a battle, and the conscience is going to try to create a behavioral code that doesn't fit with our behavior. And this is why we call it a conflict. Our conscience says one thing. It looks at our behavioral code, which has been developed up to this moment based on our prior experiences. Our behavioral code says this is not correct. You should not be denying yourself this experience, but you're still denying it. And in this particular case, you are going to have a battle within yourself. It is a battle. In this case, now we are going to look at a less constructive behavior of the ego. In this case, because we're talking about mechanisms of escape, all right? So we're now talking, and for every mechanism of escape, it's a less constructive approach of ourselves. The ego lashes out in the complete opposite direction. That direction could be a philosophical point, a physical point, psychological point, emotional point, in order to compensate for that conflict that is raging inside the individual. And eventually, but this eventually can take a day, a month, a year, a century, and I don't know, 10 reincarnation processes. Eventually, that conflict will be so large that the ego will not be able to oppose it anymore, and then it will move forward. It will accept the experience, and it will bring that as a development of the self, the inner I in us. That is when we start moving towards a perceived reality, towards a reality with capital R. But until then, we are going to act on that conflict. That conflict can be that attitude of ours based on the conflict, because the conflict is raging inside of us. It is disturbing us. Our behavior can be aggressive, can be irrational, can be coercive, can be repressive. And it is very hard sometimes to convince individuals within this context. You have to approach it from a different angle. You cannot just go and face them right away with the problem. Usually, you have to let them realize how detrimental this behavior is for them. I'll give you an example. Religious fanaticism, not religious beliefs, but fanaticism. People simply take their reasoning and throw it out of the window. Or we have these taboos or sexual conduct behaviors, for instance, and you simply cannot approach a topic with an individual who is under a mechanism of compensation. There is also another one that is more subtle and is actually quite dangerous, because it's a form of conformism. The person believes himself or herself to be a second-class human being. That's what I meant by second-class citizenry. It has nothing to do with nationalities, countries, or anything. It's thinking themselves or believing themselves to be second-class citizens. You pound on their heads so much that they are less important than another group, that they begin to believe, either they begin to believe themselves that they are second-class human beings, or in order to be accepted by the other group, which can be majority, but not necessarily so, they begin to behave like the other ones just for acceptance purpose. So this is a perception. The individual sees himself or herself as a minority, or has a sense of minority that is imposed on them. And when you have a situation like this, the belonging is much stronger than the individuality, or the self-awareness. And in this particular case, you cannot go and just tell them you're doing something that is detrimental to yourself. You have to show these individuals from a different perspective how to move away from this perceived reality. This compensation mechanism is very ingrained in them. Let us look at another one. This one is now called displacement or shifting. And this is when we move things around. So we have experiences in life that can be spiritual or physical, right? Life. And we have a censorship that is applied to every piece of experience. Every experience is censored. When I say censored, it means evaluated, judged, deconstructed, looked at in great detail, and then again evaluated, judged, okay, appraised, you name it. This healthy censorship that we should all have, this healthy censorship is important and is the beginning, and is, well, Freud located it in the superego. So it's the development of the superego. So as the number of experiences grow for the ego, what happens is that those experiences are now being censored, are being judged, are being evaluated, appraised, and they are the development of the superego. And it is important to have them, because the censorship is our way of relating to the outside world, to the outside environment, the outside being outside of ourselves, again, not of our homes. When the ego is overdeveloped, when the ego is detrimentally developed, in other words, when it has so many perceived realities and it has tossed out the checks and balances system, it's not checking itself, it does not allow the superego to interact and check. What happens is that we have the self being diminished, in relation to the ego, and we develop a rebellious behavior. This the rebellious behavior in our personality is exactly against that inner censorship. This is not censorship by laws of society, by some other people, no, it's by ourselves. We don't want or don't like, we disapprove of what we are experiencing. And that, again, creates the inner conflict. But what is important in this, and I'm underlining it now, is that we do not assign blame to people or objects. People and objects are not the source of our inner conflict. It's in some degree, I understand it to be my inability to accept what the environment is giving me. This is important because we are going to see another one when we do blame others or other things. And that is the difference between that and displacement. In displacement or shifting, we simply have this inner conflict that is a disapproval of objects or people, but we don't blame, we do not make those people or those objects the source of our conflict. So these are individuals, for instance, who do not like to obey anything. They don't like rules at point, just that. So in this situation, they displace, they shift, they transfer their disapproval, their disagreement with laws, rules, regulations, statutes to figures of authority. The police force, the fire brigade, okay, the professor, the teacher, the boss, the head of the company. It doesn't matter. But here is what is important. They do not do this on a personal basis. They don't blame the teacher, the professor. They don't blame the police force. They don't blame the fire. They just don't like the rules and regulations, the statutes. So they transfer, they shift, they displace that disapproval towards a person in this case. Or they can do the same with codes and regulations. So they go to a picnic area and they say, please clean up after yourself when you finish, right? And they don't. And they don't do it because they don't want to do it, not because they are not aware. They are fully aware that they should, let's say, clean up, not have crumbs all over, not have soda spilled all over, but they leave a mess because they disapprove of the fact that there was a plaque telling them, or a sign saying to them, clean up after yourself, clean the area, do not leave the area disorganized. It is now not against a person in particular, but against the code itself, the rule, the regulation. And that, goes without saying, is extremely detrimental because we live in a society, and in order for us to function and function well, we need to have codes, regulations, and rules. They also have misconstrued notions of competition. So when they go into contact sports in particular, they can be mean. They don't just touch one another because it's a contact sport like boxing or martial arts. They want to hurt the other person. The intention is to hurt, but it's not to hurt that person in particular. It's only to hurt. That's what is important. So they do not see the person or the object as the source of the conflict. They just disapprove of something, and they have this inner conflict in them. And this is what leads them to have a sometimes even destructive behavior. In the 70s, there were some misguided psychotherapies, therapies that basically thought about blaming everything we go through on our parents. So our parents were the source of everything. So the therapy had the parents as the source of all the conflicts, but we going through the therapy, we, the patients, we did not see them like that, but we were guided in that direction. Or therapies where the person could scream as loud as they could, especially obscenities, to vent, to some sort of a catharsis. These were psychotherapies that were misguided, poorly conducted, unfortunately, And they are forms of displacement shifting. In the end, they don't solve the inner conflict. They give a valve of escape, they give a venting, a situation for venting that inner conflict, but they do not address it. And this is important for us to understand. Projection. Projection is an interesting one. We do this quite a lot. This is the opposite of displacement, of shifting, because in projection, we do blame. So we assign fault, we assign blame, and we transfer it to that person or that something, which we then perceive as the source of the conflict. So here, I have a very good example. I like to use cartoons because I'm always concerned with the ethical approach to real life situations, but you can understand it. So here's Homer Simpson in bed, bedtime, and just look at the amount of food he has in bed, okay, on his bed. And in projection, we blame the other side. So Homer says that he's fat because food is too tasty. So this is assigning blame to an object. It is food that is responsible for him being fat because food is too tasty. So in other words, he's just saying, I cannot, basically, I cannot battle with food because the tastiness is actually what gets me. So it's not my fault. So he's not saying, oh, I'm fat because I don't exercise. I'm fat because I eat too much. I'm fat because I eat at wrong hours or whatever. No, he doesn't even look at himself. Everything is somebody else's or something else's fault. He is also not very good at work. He doesn't excel at work because the boss is always on his case. So Mr. Burns, his boss, right, in the cartoon series, is the one that is always persecuting him. So it's not a mania persecution. Let's not go there. It can develop into one, but at this point, it's a very light way of saying, it's not my fault. I don't want to look at what I might be doing wrong. So I project. In projection, I show it, I throw it away from me and onto something or someone else. The opposite of projection is introjection. So now instead of throwing things out, I pick something from outside in. But before I even go into introjection, I just want to make a quick point here. Introjection and introspection are two complete different things. Please do not confuse one with the other. Introspection is healthy. It's a look at oneself. It's what Joanna de Angelis is always telling us, not just Joanna de Angelis, but Emmanuel, all the high order spirits. They tell us introspection is a look at oneself. Is that moment during the day when, most likely when we are in bed, just getting ready to go to sleep, and we look at our day, how our day developed, what we did during that day, if we could have done something better, if we could have done more, or simply if we could have done this or that, which we did not do. That's introspection. It's look at ourselves, look inside ourselves. In introjection, and by the way, introspection is not an escape mechanism. Introjection is escape mechanism of the ego. And like I said before, is the opposite of projection. In introjection, we pick things from outside, mannerisms, behaviors, idiosyncrasies, and we pull it in. We pull them in. We bring it into our personality. We don't actually filter it very much. The ego ends up misappropriating lives, perceived realities of others, and it completely ignores its own reality or its own perceived reality, its own development. And eventually, this creates conflict in ourselves. We have this with copycats. We have this with suicides. This is one of the reasons why eventually we had a law that we have to be very careful how we um, advertise, or not advertise, how we say that someone committed a suicide in the news. You can't just keep going and giving recipes. Oh, the person did this, that, in this order. No, it's no longer possible. There's a law against that, because you may be actually giving a protocol for somebody else to commit suicide. And individuals in a process of introjection may actually copy that form of suicide. This happens a lot when we have the suicide of very important or very famous people, like stars, movie stars, or singers. There are copycats of their suicides, unfortunately. We also have in fanaticisms. You join a group, and from one reason or another, usually it's a way of being accepted, of integrating yourself to that group. You embrace, you pull everything they believe in, but you don't judge those things for yourself. So this is the fanaticism from a different perspective. The first fanaticism, the one in compensation, was more that this is it, and I don't care what you think, you're going to have to believe in the same things that I do. That's the fanaticism imposed. This is a fanaticism that is imported. In compensation, we export our fanaticism. Here is a fanaticism we import, we pull from outside in, and we leave our brains in neutral. We don't evaluate it. Does it match what I believe in? Does it match with my sense of fulfillment? Am I being fulfilled with this belief, whether it's religious, whether it's economical, political? Let's not talk about religious fanaticism necessarily here. Fantasies. We today have individuals, for instance, who are importing into their lives the stories from video games, the stories from TV movies, and trying to live those as if it were their own. It won't work. It will not work. So these fantasies are imported and are then lived at the expense of reality with capital R. Same way here, we have standardized behavior, when people conform to situations, embracing those situations for one reason or another, which we'll not discuss here, but they conform. And they in this conformism, they don't stop to think whether that is producing some sense of fulfillment for them. Same thing for uniformity and many others. And finally, we have the crown jewel of escape mechanisms. And we do this, oh boy, so easily. It's second nature to us to justify ourselves. Instead of stopping and looking inside ourselves, instead of stopping and doing an introspection, which is a healthy, productive, constructive process of looking inside ourselves, looking at ourselves, we spout out a pseudo-rational explanation. This is, like I said, the crown jewel. It's the most prevalent of the 5 mechanisms. It's pervasive, it's everywhere. It is subtle, we don't even realize it, and it is atavic. We roll it over from one reincarnation to the next, and it's completely democratic, absolutely indiscriminate. We use this everywhere in our lives. It's a form of rationalization. I don't like the word rationalization, but I've seen it in books in English. It's actually a pseudo-rationalization, because it's not really rationalization. Because a rationalization would say, look at yourself, do an introspection, evaluate what you're doing, and don't say such a thing. But sometimes it is referred as a rationalization process. Okay? Now, what is it if we want to... I'm sorry, let's go back here. If we want to get an example, well, I wake up late. I have to be at work at 9, and I get there at 10 past, and it was the elevator. It took me longer than most days. Did it? This is the question. Did it? Did it take longer because of the other, or because someone parked in my spot? Was a car really parked on your spot? Oh, the bus did not show up. Are you sure, or did you get to the bus stop after the bus had already passed? After the bus had already um, passed by the bus stop. So we just say it. This is why it's a pseudo rational explanation. Now, are you really sure? Have you timed the elevator, how long it takes for you to get to the elevator and take the elevator to ride down? It is possible, that is true. That day the elevator broke and you're stuck inside. That's fine. But is it really true that it was the elevator? We don't know. You don't stop. You don't really compare things properly, but you spout out the explanation. You spout out this pseudo-rational explanation. And we have so many others. We are always, always giving an excuse. It's what we call the lame excuse. It's the famous lame excuse. We don't really assign blame or fault to anything or anyone, but we come up with an excuse. And by doing that, we forgo looking at ourselves. I was late because this, that, and the other. I eat too much. I don't respect deadlines. I do not respect the laws. But no, we don't go there. And by spouting out, by giving pseudo-rational explanations, we not only forgo an inner look, but we deprive ourselves of growth, of moral, of ethical growth, of spiritual growth. When we say that we should know ourselves, and first of all, to thy own self be true, that we say nowadays as if it meant nothing. This is a very simple phrase to know ourselves, but it's very, very intense. It's very, very rich, because this implies that we have to be honest with ourselves. Nobody's asking us to get a trumpet and to say things out loud to other people. No, but to start within ourselves with a concept of honesty, of looking at ourselves and saying, yeah, today I just stayed in bed a little longer than I should have, and that's why I was late. No, I stepped on the grass. I knew I was not supposed to, but at the time, I really couldn't care less. Well, now you have a ticket. Now you have a fine. So is it the officer, the guard, the groundskeeper that is responsible? No. Is it the system? No. Is it the rules? No. You knew it before you did it. But how many times do we truly stop to do these things? And this brings another important point when Joanna de Angelis tells us that we have to move away from this automated form of living. What she is actually saying to us very, very diligently is, you have to evaluate every action, every thought, every word you put out there. Because otherwise, if you live in an automated way, you will be using pseudo-rational explanations for everything, and you'll just be stalling your own progress. Being aware of what we are doing is not a neurotic way of living one's life, because being aware is not to reprimand oneself. It's just that, being aware. But if I do everything in the automatic mode, I am not even aware that I'm doing this, that, and the other. There are individuals who live their lives in such a hurry. It can be equated to hurriness, okay? That you ask them right after they arrive, right when they arrive at work, oh, what did you have for breakfast? And they can't tell you. They don't know what they had for breakfast. They ate because there was the id in them, the instinct told them, I'm hungry. They got the first thing that they saw, or perhaps something that they always have in the same place, the same position, but they don't remember. And we do this with other things in life. We're not talking about food. We are not talking about a habit. We are talking about ingrained behaviors that can be extremely detrimental, first and foremost, to ourselves. We're not even talking about others. We're talking about ourselves. We are giving pseudo-rational explanations for others so that we can appease the conflict within. Hence, escape mechanism. If we did not have the conflict inside of ourselves, it would feel like a rational explanation, not pseudo-rational, but a rational explanation, and there would be no problem. There would not be escape mechanism. The fact that it is escape mechanism tells us that there is a conflict in us. We know somehow that we are doing something that is not useful, constructive to us, and we are escaping it. Escaping the addressing that, evaluating it. Like I said, this is the most subtle, most atavic, most pervasive, most indiscriminate, or if you prefer, the most democratic of all five. And we do this everywhere, every time. And we have to be careful about it. What do we have to do? We have to de-identify ourselves in order for us to move on in our cosmic progress. And we don't uproot the ego. The ego is part of us. The ego is us. We are the ego. It's like the tree holding an axe and trying to cut its own roots. It's going to die. The ego is part of us. What we have to do is move away from tendencies, is move away from perceived realities, is doing introspection, evaluating ourselves from inside out. Look at our personality. Watch for the building blocks of that personality on a regular basis. Tiny little steps, baby steps each time. This is important because then we are going to have an expansion of our ego, but in a healthy way. We are going to get increasing number of experiences, and we are going to be pulling in all the information that those experiences can provide to us. And in having more information, more pieces of information, we are going to create a much larger knowledge base, and a much better, much more encompassing behavioral code, which will only allow us to interact more efficiently, more constructively with the environment. That code of behavior is going to be an inner censorship, but not in a negative sense. Someone with a finger always up and saying, you don't do this, you don't do that. No, quite the opposite. The inner censorship will be like a guardian, like the moat protecting the castle, protecting the barricades, protecting everything there, because it will say, look, before I incorporate this, let me understand what it is. Let me evaluate it. Let me appraise it, so that once I decide it is good, it's progressive, it's constructive for myself, I can give myself to it. I can bring it into my personality without the fear that it eventually might turn into something destructive. This censorship is important and should never be seen in a negative connotation. The ego, of course, is that, like the id is the instinct. The ego is the closest thing to remember, it's right above the id, and it has a part that goes all the way down into even the unconscious part. The ego that is unconscious is the part that is atavic, that we bring from other reincarnation processes. And it has a tendency to dominate the personality, and a tendency to keep us shackled to those experiences we are comfortable with. Because Every new reality, every new perceived reality, every new situation brings an inner conflict. Inner conflicts are not necessarily bad. They're just two things that usually do not match. For me to learn something new, I have to deconstruct what I learned before, and add that part in, and then reconstruct whatever I had, whatever object was being studied. So when I learn something from life, when I learn something from life, that means that I had whatever I had before. I deconstructed it, then I brought in the new information, put it together, mixed it, and reconstructed a better self, a better I, a better personality for myself. Sometimes we don't want to do this process. We are rebellious against it. And then we stick to perceived realities. As we shackle ourselves to perceived realities through our egos, we cease to progress. We don't go backwards, but we cease to progress. De-identifying ourselves to perceived reality is exactly that. We have to look at ourselves through introspection and say to ourselves, okay, I have a tendency to over justify in this situation. So I need to de identify myself with those situations. We have to pick one and start with one. Maybe I'm always late for work. Maybe I am always given excuses about the traffic, about this or that. Or maybe I always answer people in a very rude way, even if I don't mean to be rude, but I do sound rude. I know I sound rude, and I do that. And I don't, and I say to myself inside myself, I don't care. So maybe this is the time to deconstruct that behavior. In deconstructing, I have to de-identify myself with my old Julio, with my old self. So no more rudeness when addressing people, or no more being late. We have to de-identify, deconstruct, disassociate ourselves from these perceived realities. Or I have to say to myself, okay, it's not that I'm being this, that, or the other, which are all negative or destructive behaviors, but I don't incorporate anything new. So I am the famous person that says that, oh, an old dog cannot learn new tricks. So maybe that's what I have to address. You address these things by trying to dismantle that past behavior, that prior behavior. This is a long process. Do not believe you're going to go like that with your fingers and you're going to bed one day and the next day you're going to fall to get out of bed completely. No, it doesn't work like that. This is why Joana de Anjos has an entire collection of books, not just one. And even the books outside of the collection continue to tell us to be patient, but never to lose hope, that they are always there to assist us, the spiritual world, the members of the spiritual world, the high order spirits. They are with us. They know, they have gone through this process of de-identification, of deconstruction, of disassociation. They understand the rigor, the discipline that is required, but they also know, this is the part that we don't know, they know the rewards that await us once we move away from these perceived realities, to which we are shackled by our egos. In this process of de-identifying ourselves, we build our self. The self that Joana de Anjos speaks so much and so highly of, which is a conscience that gradually emerges in us through these multiple experiences, through the very development of the ego. An ego that is not developed will never have a self. You need a developed ego to create the conflict in the first place. And it's in solving conflicts that we build the self. The self is, in a way, if we are going to merge Joana de Anjos and Freud, the self is, in a way, a daughter or son or an offspring, let's put it this way in general terms, an offspring of the ego. Without the ego being there in the first place and somewhat developed, we wouldn't have the self. It is important because the ego brings the experiences in. The experiences bring through the behavioral code that is developed by many and multiple experiences and prior experiences, produce conflicts, and the conflicts in trying to solve them, to de-identify ourselves from perceived reality, is what leads us to the self. And now we are going to look at all of this through an animation. Experience sets, birth of the self or beginning of the self, and ego self struggles, which is all natural and healthy. I told you before in the part 3 of this lecture that we had experiences, and the multitude of experiences led to the development of the ego. As you see in this diagram, multiple experiences, there are about 10 experiences over there, and the ego meter filled with the red bar. So now I want to tell you one thing. I'm going to go from experiences to an experience set. What is an experience set? An experience set is nothing more than a group of experiences. So imagine, for instance, I'm going to get 100 experiences, and I'm going to call this the experience set 1. Then in another one, I will have 1,000 experiences. I'm going to call it experience set 2. It doesn't matter how many experiences there are in each set. They don't have to be all the same number. What is important is that each experience set is a collection now of experiences. So as you can understand, just naturally, an experience set is much larger than an experience. An experience set takes much longer to acquire than just an experience, whatever they are. We are not concerned of what these experiences are. Hence, this geometric figure that is, that's so crazy. This is going to create the experience set. And you notice that in the experiences, I drew the figures with a gradient from green to yellow. And in the experience set, I put from red to yellow. Well, I was thinking of mangoes when I did this. The green represents not ripe. It's the very beginning. I have to start with experiences. But when I put them all together and I make a set, I have matured a little bit. The red indicates ripeness. I have matured a little bit. But I did not want to make it completely red because I wanted to have a little bit of yellow there, still see that there is room for improvement. Hence the gradient of colors. All right? The gradient of colors in the green to yellow on the left side of your screen for experiences, and the gradient of color from red to yellow on the right side of your screen for the experience set. So everything now that I represented as an experience set, I hope you have in your mind calibrated it for a group of multiple experiences, whatever the number is. The number is not important. Even the experiences at this point, they're not important. What is important is you get the collection idea. And now we have an experience set. We have now a conscience that pulls them in and creates a knowledge. The experience sets provides information from the outside. That is now concatenated by our conscience. It is woven, interwoven into knowledge. It's no longer just a phone number. It's a phone number to which I associate, I like this person, I dislike this person, I have a professional relationship with this person, and so on and so forth. So it's a knowledge. It's more than just a telephone number. This knowledge then gets accumulated, gets improved, gets expanded, and it creates a behavior, my behavior. Because we're now not talking just a telephone number, we're talking so many different experiences. So this dictates how I interact back with that environment, with that surroundings. So that's the behavior. So as I experience more and more, I create more and more experience sets now. And these now experience sets that you saw popping up on the left side of your screen are going to give me a developed ego, and is going to lead me not only to behavior, but now to multiple little rules, internal rules, my rules. So my code of behavior. And my code of behavior now will begin to evaluate what the ego is doing and will be creating inner conflicts. Conflict here is not in a negative sense. Conflict here is simply what I had and what I have now, this difference. Okay? Just that. And if I solve it, if I solve it constructively, it's great. If I don't solve it constructive, it's not great. And now we see the appearance of the self slowly. So you see that the bar, the self meter is empty. There's still no self. We are going to see now the self being created. The self is going to come out from the ego-self conflicts, from the evaluation of what the ego is doing through that code of behavior. So we have back here, we know the ego creates inner conflicts when it does anything that is being evaluated by the code of behavior. If the evaluation is positive or negative, doesn't matter. The fact that it's being evaluated is an inner conflict. It's not something that I'm taking for granted. So let us start with a single experience set. And now I want you to focus the attention, your attention, to this side of the screen that is now highlighted in yellow. So let's get rid of the yellow. And this is what we are going to focus our attention on. That is going to be a battle between the ego and the self. You don't lose ego, okay? Be careful with this. It just means that the ego gives some space for the self to work, for the self to develop. This is now a relative bar, a relative progress bar. Before it was always absolute because I only had the ego. But now I'm adjusting the ego based on the self or vice versa. It doesn't matter. It's the same result. So if one bar shrinks, the other one has to increase because it's always the summation of the two that gives the full, the totality, which is myself. So this is what is going on between these two. Now let's look at this through a much longer period. I want you to look at and focus your attention only on this area of the screen that is in yellow. We are going to see experience sets all the way on the left increasing, and we are going to see what happens to the inner conflicts as the experience sets increase, what happens to the ego as the experience sets increase, and what happens to the self as the experience sets increase. And let's go. So at the beginning is ego, very little self, right? So then we start building more and more experiences, which will eventually give us a new experience set. So now we have experience sets, plural. And you see now that the ego is becoming less prominent. That's what these bars are indicating. We're not losing ego to gain self. You don't lose ego to gain self. It just becomes less prominent, less active. There's going to be more of a self in this process because we are resolving the conflicts. We are losing or de-identifying ourselves from those perceived realities. You see that in green is showing up now. The self is the part that is responsible for the de-identification from those perceived realities. And it's an identification now with the reality with capital R, the cosmic conscience, the divine reality. Like I said, reality with a capital R. And we just keep increasing the number of experience sets. Don't forget, each experience set is a multitude of experiences. So if we have now 10 experiences sets there, just simple math, and each one is 10 experiences, it's 10 times 10, it's 100. But of course, it's not just that. We are talking about thousands and thousands, and this is a process because we can roll this over from one reincarnation to the next, into others. This is a process that is producing the atavism in us. So this is a process that is going through multiple reincarnation processes. We don't go through this overnight, like I said. We don't go through this just by clicking our heels or our fingers. And in the end, when we have developed our self, our space, self, well, our ego is less prominent when we act. This does not mean we lost ego. These meters are just saying that today, when I reach this point, when I act, when I interact with the environment, the surroundings, I am much more self than I am ego. I am much less instinctive or tendency to be instinctive, right, than I used to be. I think way more. I weigh my behavior before I actually exercise it. I manifest it. And this is the importance. It is this deconstruction of our perceived realities, or de-identification, from them, that is leading us to identify ourselves with the nature of God, with the nature of the universal love, the love with a capital L, with the idea charity at this point, when we reach this stage, charity is second nature to us. If you ask a person at this point, a spirit, why did you do it that way? Why were you so charitable? Why were you so loving, so understanding, so compassionate? Do you know what that spirit will say to you? Do you think that he's going to explain to you, I did because this, that? He's going to say, because I did not know any way else, any way else to act. I had no other idea how to act. This is what came to me naturally. This is the stage of identification with the cosmic conscience. The Spirit doesn't call it charity. The Spirit doesn't call it compassion, understanding. No, all these are nonsensical to that Spirit. It is the only way that Spirit knows when it comes to acting. We are far from it. Today, even when we are in the best of our behaviors, we have a justification for it. Oh, I did it because, I study Spiritism, and Spiritism and this, that, and the other. They say this. Yeah, it's true. And it's good. It's a way of starting it. But it is far from the end of the journey. It's far from the point of plenitude. At plenitude, this type of spirit with very little ego manifesting, as opposed to the self, which donates of itself completely in the interactions with the surroundings. Here we have a spirit that has reached such a point that doesn't know any other way, I should say, of acting, of behaving, of saying something, of even thinking. Malice does not occur to this person anymore. They have forgotten what malice was. This is the true de-identification of all perceived realities. And when we identify ourselves with the Creator and become co-creators in a minor scale, to use the words from Evolution into Worlds by the Spirit André Luiz, actually dictated by the Spirit André Luiz, because it was actually from an echelon of high order spirits, and psychographed by Francisco Xavier and Valdo Vieira. So this is the plenitude that Joana de Angelis talks to us about. When the self is the most prominent in our manifestations, whether it's verbal manifestation, thought manifestation, or through our actions. This is what I wanted to bring to you. How these mechanisms of escape of the ego can actually be detrimental to us, because they prevent this self first from being formed. And even if it is formed, the conflict between ego and self, the battle between ego and self, prevents the self from growing, from developing, and prevents us from reaching plenitude. But the moment that we de-identify ourselves from our perceived realities, we move on. So this brings us to the part 7 of our lecture. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to address them. But just before we go there, I just want to say thank you very much for watching, for having had the patience to sit for almost 2 hours. As you saw, it is very difficult to break this type of lecture into pieces. You might say, oh, but I could have done it in 10-minute increment. No, you could not. You can now because you have seen it the whole thing from beginning to end. But when you are doing it, it's very, very hard. So I apologize. I know it was long, but I hope that you enjoyed it, that you gained something from it. I'm thankful for the invitation and for your presence. Thank you very much. And we can address the questions now.
It's awesome. Thank you. As I mentioned before, Julio, I have terrible, terrible allergies today. We have several questions, but I wanted to know how much longer can we use you? 10
Uh,
minutes?
no,
You
I'm
good?
free. It's Sunday. I'm
All
free.
right.
Yes. Yeah,
So I'm gonna
if there is interest, yes.
yeah, yes, but let's start from the bottom and go until the top, if you will. But I wanted to just share something here because we have here, wasn't St. Francis a good example of the de-identification that you just talked at the end, from perceived realities and identification with the cosmic conscience, right? Where he went, he started very conflicted in his family expectations, right? Meaning the ego was very much present until through all that he went through, he became very much identified with that cosmic conscience. What are your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. All the major figures in Spiritism, in Christianity, let's say,
Yeah,
to be more general,
yeah.
okay, are examples of a process of de-identification. Bezerra de
Hmm.
Menezes, for instance, when
Yes.
he gets to the point, what is it that he takes his ring, right, and gives it to one of his patients to buy the medicine because he didn't have any money on him, and she needed the medication for her daughter, I believe it was. That's this is not detachment. I'm not talking de-identification, not just detachment. Detachment is one of the many minor
Yeah.
steps, but it's much more. It's beyond what we can put in like in one action or another. The de-identification is a much broader situation. And yes, all of these very good point. And
Yeah.
if you want to have that one, if you identify yourself with St. Francis, whoever wrote that,
Uh-huh.
go ahead because it's a great example.
Awesome. Awesome. So let me go to the next one, which is this one, where we talked about the thoughts. This is the escape mechanism about justification. Could it be that the justification is a positive mechanism when you talk about protecting the person from an unhealthy sense of guilt?
Hmm. Okay, I understand. No, the mechanisms of escape, when we are talking about justification,
Hmm.
it's always detrimental. It's in a detrimental state because we basically, it's a lame excuse we give to ourselves. In
Hmm.
doing this lame excuse, let's say, this is very vulgar or um, um, it's a very simple way of putting it. But whenever we justify, whenever we use these pseudo rational, we avoid confronting the issue.
Right, right.
The reason the issue arrived is because we are ripe to do it, or because we are pursuing it constantly. And then we have to look at why we are pursuing it on a regular basis. So, one way or the other, we are after it. So, I understand the question, and I think it's a very good one. Yeah. Unhealthy guilt is actually monitored by the superego,
I
which
see.
by the conscience in developing the code of behavior.
Hmm.
It's there that we are going to prevent ourselves from going to these spirals of unhealthy guilt mechanisms that prevent us. This is what called pathological guilt.
Yes.
The one that we don't say, "Oh, I made a mistake there." No, it's not just that. Oh, I made a mistake there. Oh, I'm such a wretch. I'm such a bad person. I'm such this, and then you don't move on. So this is the
Yeah.
pathological guilt when it goes
Yeah.
into extreme. There we have other things that in the code of our behavior that will allow us to have a healthy relationship with our guilt. We are going to use the guilt as a trampoline, as a platform to build a better self for ourselves.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Good
Um,
question. Very good.
we got several good ones. Does so we're I guess going through backwards, right, into the escape mechanism. Does interjection as an escape mechanism have anything to do with herd mentality? And I think Joanna DeAngelis in I think it was the Empty Lives. She talks a lot about of that uh, uh, this herd mentality, right, Julia, where we are following those quote unquote influencers, and we start to lose our own sense of direction and guidance.
Yes, in a way, it's the self, it's the very definition of the interjection.
Oh, I
You
see.
you you want you basically put yourself or your brain in neutral,
Uh huh.
and you get pushed like a car. You push the car. You
Uh huh.
put your car in neutral and you push it. So what is pushing it is the herd. It is actually the group. So
Yeah.
the group mentality, the it's creating a situation, but you are choosing the escape mechanism. It's important that we understand that escape mechanisms are choices we make. I decide to put my brain in neutral. I move
Uh huh.
from geared to neutral. I do it. What happens afterwards is that they're just consequences. But what started was my moving from geared to neutral.
And the gear
From
would be your filters, right? Your not filters per se, but your actively awareness of what's going on.
yeah, we have to be very careful because of the industrial revolution, we change our behavior from being to having
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
strongly. If you want
Yes.
to understand this carefully, read Having or Being from Eric Fromm, the book Having
What is
or
the book again?
to have or I think it's Having or Being
Love it.
from Eric
Thank you.
Fromm. I can give you quickly here. I have it. Um, It's from Eric with CH at the end, from
Uh-huh.
FROMM. Okay. You
Uh-huh.
are going to get this, let's see here. To have or to be, I'm sorry, to have or to be, Eric Fromm.
Mm-hmm.
So the concept, for instance, before the Industrial Revolution, you would go, let's say if there were, okay, psychologists and therapists there, you would, so today, what do? We go to a psychologist and we say, I have a problem. I have insomnia.
Yeah.
How can you have a problem? A problem is an abstract thing. You don't have anything. I am suffering from insomnia. I am going through a difficulty, through a problem. You don't have the problem. Eric Fromm has a beautiful, it's actually quite disturbing in a way.
Uh-huh.
It's funny too. It's like a half a page with very small print where he gets this example from I go to the doctor, I have a problem, I have insomnia, this, all with haves.
Uh-huh.
And you read that and say, where is he going with this? Because this is normal. And then he says, how can you have the problem? How can you have insomnia?
Yeah.
And he goes all the way. So one thing that happens was, and this affects when we read the Greek, the classics, especially the Plato, all of them. Um, the words active
Uh,
and passive have changed as well, and we made such a mess of it that we tried to make a situation that today we have ridiculous things such as proactive. Proactive is the same thing as real reality,
Uh-huh.
but we say it.
Yes.
But
Yes.
we say it, and we say it, and we don't even pay attention to it, and we
I, I use that term a lot in my work. The
yeah,
proactive
if you are
versus reactive. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
if you read just this part in Eric Fromm's book, you're going to see how we could say the same thing, but with the idea of pre 1750, when
Hmm.
the first
Sure.
stage of the Industrial Revolution started, and we would
Uh-huh.
see how much we have distorted. What active meant for the Greeks is not what is meant today.
That's very
Well, not just the
interesting.
Greeks, but
Yeah.
in
I
the
understand. Antiquity, yeah. Or
antiquity.
pre industrial revolution age, right?
Yes.
So
And
I
what
think
happened?
it's, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and what happens is that we have these words today, and we get all confused because it's like a double meaning sometimes. And in some cases, in the same word, you have two pieces, one negates the other.
Yeah.
Like
Interesting.
it's like an inner oxymoron.
Yes.
It's like it's mind-boggling, and it's only when you get someone that can explain things so well that you realize how much we have slipped down this slope. And this is with respect with escape mechanisms. Escape mechanisms are negative. They are non-negative, I should say, non-constructive behaviors or
I see.
non-constructive attitudes, whatever you want to call them. And herd mentality is when we cease to be active in the old sense.
Or even that's a very good way of saying, Julio. And I would say when we cease to be or desire to reach our own individuality, right? So
Yes, in
it's
a way.
you let go of our individuality to the herd, right? To the collective. Very
And this
interesting.
happens in the Spiritist Center. Since we are Spiritists here, we can say this.
Yeah,
People come to the Spirit Center, it's very common. And then
yeah,
because it came from, let's say, André Luiz,
yeah,
or because it came from Joana de Angelis, or from Emmanuel, from Humberto de Campos, or this, that, they believe. They don't
yeah,
question.
yeah.
They simply do not question. And if you try to question, it's almost like heresy. I'll give
Yes.
you an example. We recently had a discussion about the
Uh,
passage from John, from the Gospel, when Jesus turned water into wine.
yes.
So I asked the group at the time, why do you trust it? Number one, it was only given to one of the apostles. We don't see anybody else saying the same thing. Everything else, all the passages about Jesus are corroborated by another apostle. Number two, the New Testament was written 200 to 300 years later in Greek,
Yes.
not hearing it directly from the apostles. So
Yeah.
it is very possible that there was some distortion
Yes.
because this was
We're
okay
not saying
oral.
that is, but it's possible, right?
But
That
the
is,
fact
yeah.
that people don't even question it is scary. So
Yeah.
this is the herd mentality. This is escape
Yes.
mechanism.
Yeah.
It's a subtle, but it's there. And now, fortunately, this was an amazing group. And as we discussed, everyone was, wow, that's right. And people did not go, oh, you're going against the Bible, because then you get the ones with the compensation mechanism. They say, no, if it's in
Yes.
the Bible, that's it,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And they get aggressive towards you. The aggression is compensation. The belief that is true is interjection.
Very
They pull
interesting.
it,
Yeah.
incorporate it, and now nobody can touch it. Now, if someone touches it, they compensate by being aggressive.
Yeah. It's very interesting, Julio, in your example of bringing a passage, be it from a spiritist author, well reputable, well acknowledged, and you mentioned Bezerra Emmanuel, Andre Luiz, Joanna de Angelis, but in Joanna de Angelis, I think it's the integral human being. She has a chapter on specifically religion and religiosity, and one of the things that she puts forth, I don't know if you remember that book, in that chapter specific, what she calls upon us having the courage to confront and criticize in any religion. We're not talking about spiritism or Christianity or anything, in any religion, for us to attain the true sense of emotional religiosity, which is that connection with God. we should have the courage to view and criticize. So this is really very, very clearly aligned to what you say here uh, about interjection and your example. So thank you for that.
Sure. That particular chapter, she even goes a little further and says, "Your faith will never be strong if you never question anything."
That's right.
And the problem that we have, another thing that changed during the Industrial Revolution,
Uh-huh.
was that we began to see everything as a competition, as a negative competition. So to question does not mean what we do today, to have an opinion, and to have an opinion willy-nilly without investigate. To question means to have it running, spinning inside of your head, like a little mouse in a treadmill,
Yeah.
that spinning wheel, and
Yeah.
it's have it there, and then that leads you to read another book, that leads you to ask somebody else, or to
Yeah.
discuss with a colleague, with a friend, or maybe even someone from a Spiritist center. But questioning is in terms of asking about it. It's not in terms of defying it. We see it always as defiance,
Yeah.
or as,
Yeah.
"Oh, I don't like it." Wait, wait, wait. You cannot say that.
Yeah.
You have the right to think, but you not don't have the right to. If you do, if you're going to say it, to speak it, you have to say, "I don't like it because this, that, and the other, and I suggest this." This is a
Yeah.
constructive way.
This goes right into the other question that I'm going to bring it here, because you talked about religious fanaticism, right, as an example. And so the question here is, can you talk more about how the sense of belonging in some of us, I think you mentioned that the need to belong is stronger than have that rational critical thinking, right? So how can the sense of belonging, some of us can become so strong that we need to compensate as an escape mechanism. So in your example was religious fanaticism, and today, Julio, that goes beyond that, right? We have adopted somehow some dogmatic, if you will, thought processes, not only around religion, where dogma is a related word, but about politics, for example, about economics, about science, even. And I wonder, where does it come from? All of it. This is just not my thought, but let's look into the question.
So when we speak of what is the sense of belonging,
Yeah,
why is it so strong that we need to compensate as an escape mechanism,
yeah, yeah,
and particularly in religious fanaticism? So I'm gonna say first something very general.
yeah.
Um, the ego is so inflated these days, so poorly developed, in the sense that it has developed in the wrong direction, that we no longer say, "I espouse this opinion." What we say is, "Anyone who does not think like me is my enemy."
Yeah.
So there's no other opinion.
So it
It's
goes back to
either,
what you're saying in that competitiveness of
yes.
post-industrial age, right? That's leading us more and more to be very combative against each other, including the opinions. Very interesting. But go
And
ahead.
this comes from the fact that we truly have not espoused that opinion. We have done an introspection,
Interjection, right?
introjection of it.
Yes,
Instead of
yeah,
doing an introspection, evaluating it, seeing if I feel fulfilled by it or not, which is the part of the previous question. When you go to the center, when you interact, you have
yeah,
to see if it's fulfilling you. Because if it's not fulfilling, it's not good for you,
yes.
and period. No one can judge that. So
Uh-huh.
because we don't introspect to evaluate, to appraise, to judge, we simply pull it in, we interject.
Yeah,
Now it's mine. No, it's like a piece of property. My
yeah.
opinion ceases, is again the having or the being. I am not a human being with an opinion. The opinion is my identification.
Oh,
So
very
the moment
interesting.
that you graze, as
Uh,
much as graze that opinion, you're going against me.
yeah.
It becomes, it's not even personal. It becomes a point of self identification.
Uh-huh.
The person
And
lashes
I
out.
wonder, just real quick here, what came to my mind when you're speaking, because this is really interesting. It goes beyond the very external. It's a fact, right? An event. I'm going to look into that event, and I'm going to filter in terms in the realm of my opinions, my ideas, right? And as we're talking here, but then that idea, that opinion, that is, as you mentioned, very superficial yet, has not been introspected, but it has been introjected in terms of now I use that as my identity. Now, the question, and I don't know if you even have an answer to this, Julio, but how does it reflect perhaps that sense of back to the atavism, right? That unconscious collect collective unconscious that brings that we insert in is as immortal beings. Just a thought, right? All in this fanaticism, right? All in this. I I I am now going to fight with you, and we've seen that in the past 2, 3, 4 years, where society has become so polarized that families will stop to talk to each other because of different ideas on A, B, C, or D.
Hmm. True.
Right? Just a thought.
So the compensation mechanisms are primarily a response to our insecurities.
Uh huh.
You could use insecurity for some of the others, or all the others, even in some cases, but primarily the compensation mechanisms are derived from our insecurities. Our insecurities are all the unsolved issues we bring from our past lives.
I
So
see.
it's the it's not the negative side. I would like to call it the unresolved part of our atavisms, of our
Yeah, our
experience.
baggage that we bring, right,
It's
Julio?
the baggage, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so uh, it's we like I said, for the person who the brother or sister who created this question, the what I would say is we all have to de-identify ourselves from our opinions. You are a human being. You are a beautiful, intelligent creation of our Lord. You exist outside your opinions. Your opinions do not define who you are. We
Hmm.
think they do, that they
Yeah.
actually define. No, we need to understand that we are beautiful for just being part of the creation of our Lord. Ex- Completely apart from opinions, the way we live, if we are good, if we are bad, if we are even a criminal, it doesn't matter.
Uh huh.
We are separate from all of these things. Contextualization, society, times, all these things, they conspire to create a sense of belonging. They conspire to create a sense of identity that is false. We belong to ourselves, and we then express opinions. We shouldn't even say that we have opinions.
I love it. Yes.
Because
Yeah.
you can't hold it. It's not a question of being friends. I like to say to people, don't be ethical. Don't have ethics. I say to people, and then they
Yes.
open their
Uh-huh.
eyes this
Yeah.
big. I
Yeah.
said, don't have friends, and again, and I say, be ethical.
Love it.
No, be a
A
friend.
friend. Yeah. I
Be
love
a
it.
friend
Yes.
is different. It is the difference between active and passive. How many people say, "Oh, I have 1,000 friends in Facebook," or it doesn't matter in a social media?
Yeah.
Okay, in a social media, and are they really friends? How do you know?
Yeah.
Even say it's only in difficult times that we realize who are our true friends, and who are
Yeah.
not, right?
Yeah.
So you can't really say that this is a possession. This We're counting people, and
Yeah.
we are reducing people to a number.
Yeah.
So in this case, what can we do? We have to see our opinions as just that, as an opinion. This is
Yeah.
how I think. This is how I interact with the rest of the world. Um, It's what fulfills me.
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm right. I don't know if I have the right to exercise that thought process. I even have the exercise the right to exercise the choice. But in the same way that I have that choice and I
uh,
have the right to exercise the choice, the right is to exercise the choice. I have to give that right to somebody else who has or may manifest a different opinion.
absolutely. I even say this is a call to action to all of us, an invitation. Let us change or be very specific about the language and shift from I right to I have this opinion into this is my opinion today because it may change tomorrow.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
let me look to see if there's any other one. I think there's one. I don't know if we can talk about this. Is there a way to counter our unwillingness to revise our individual perspectives so that we're less prone to use compensation escape mechanism? I think you mentioned that early on, right? That compensation is the one, those who are unwilling to be open are those more prone to use compensation. Do you remember? Do you recall saying that?
Mhm. So the unwillingness comes from a position of comfort. It's our comfort zone, as we say colloquially.
Uh-huh.
We are comfort about something. So if someone comes and brings something, or something, it doesn't have to be a person. If the environment presents something that is slightly different from what we are used to, that is a point of conflict. Not
Uh-huh.
negative, not positive, just something different.
Yeah.
So the unwillingness comes exactly at that moment, whether I am going to put some energy into absorbing that, evaluating it. So I think the best way at our level is to see how much we have automated our actions, our
Interesting.
behaviors,
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
because it's there that we are going to see it's in the automation processes
Yeah.
that we are going to find these little rules we created for ourselves. I have to behave this way, this in this order,
Yeah.
and this is what creates the unwillingness, creates
Yeah.
a barrier. It's a psychological barrier.
Yeah.
If
I
we
have
don't
to
have
I have to share this other question because you are very in tune with these questions. Because the one prior to that one is, am I correct to think that the more intentional our experiences are, the more structured the ego is? What do you think? Because you're just talking about that, be very intentional. Don't you think?
the ego has to be structured.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Uh-huh.
I think what they meant, whoever put the question through, meant not necessarily structure the ego, but self-reliant or
Uh-huh.
demanding,
Yeah.
because then the ego imposes itself on everything else.
Uh-huh.
So in that sense, yes, but
Uh-huh.
we we can have intentions, but the intentions have to be preceded by an evaluation. So I don't know if that was considered when they wrote the question, when they said, when they asked it. So um, it is always intentional when we're talking about the part of the ego that is in the awareness part, in the
Yeah.
conscious part.
Yes.
Um, whatever is below is either atavic, or it's the gears moving in an automated process.
Yeah. And I
Some
think that's what when you use the word automatism, that it made
yes.
me think about it, right? So if I were to add to this, what I read from this question is that we perhaps should consider being less automated in our responses and including our falling into one of those escape mechanism of the ego, right? To become very intentional, or even to use a more contemporary word, a more mindful. in our experiences.
I'll give you an example, a practical example, so why I'm
Uh-huh.
being so picky about the word intentional. I really
Uh-huh.
like the questions, by the way. No questions asked. No complaints. Really like it. Um, One way of progressing quite rapidly is when I have an intention, I manifest the intention. It
I
become
see.
becomes an action or a speech, even a thought. Because with the thought, we can also very spiritually interfere with another being. Interference here, positively or negatively. Okay. Um, when I manifest that intention, I can make a big boo boo. I can make a big problem. I can create an
Uh-huh.
issue for myself or even for the other person. But in the process of saying, first of all, in the process of becoming aware of the consequences, of the results,
Yes. Yes.
and then saying, I am sorry, genuinely, sincerely, it's a huge growth. And it started with an intention that was not positive. Another example, you see someone in distress, horrible distress, like life threatening distress, and you go and you try to help, and you make things worse. You're going to say that your intentions was to kill the person or to make the person suffer even more? Of course not.
No.
The
Yeah.
intentions were good. So it's
Yeah.
not necessarily being intentional. It's when we lock ourselves into this automatism and we want to do it A, then B, then C, then D, and we will not go A, B, C, E. We will not skip a letter. It's
Yeah.
this it's like we freeze ourselves and we always want to apply that to everything.
Yeah. Almost robotic
It's,
responses, right?
yeah,
Or
yeah.
predetermined responses.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. There is a
Uh-huh.
beautiful fable, very quickly here, of Procrustes. Procrustes was one of the demigods in the Greek mythology.
Uh-huh.
He had his home in one of the mountains near Athens, and every passerby had to go through his home, and he had a bed. So it's called the Procrustean bed. And
Uh-huh.
the Procrustean bed, he would ask the traveler, he actually would entice the passerby, the traveler, to lay on the bed. And then if the person was too short, he would stretch the
I
person
know about that.
and then kill the person in the process. If the person had legs that would not fit the bed, he would cut them off to fit the bed and again would kill the person, right? Um, so it's like this. It's a Procrustean bed. We
Yeah,
uh, we we try to force reality to fit our behavior, not the
that's
other way
right.
around. Is the other way around is also not correct, because it's not that we want to fit reality. We want to incorporate reality,
Uh,
evaluate it, the introspection again,
yeah.
evaluate it, and then return a manifestation or a behavior towards that reality.
Yeah, and I love what you said, what you end your discussion with, how the inner conflicts are actually a very positive mechanism for us to incorporate that reality, the exposure to experiences or experience sets to our ego, right? I think, Julia, we only have a couple of more minutes. So
I'm
I'm
fine.
going to load you with the last question, but I think we don't have too much more time. So let's look at it. I believe you mentioned monad as the very basic, most primitive component of our personality. Can you explain more about the process of transformation from monad to the individualized personality? And I know this is loaded because I believe you have written about it. You have had discussed this previously, right, Julia? So
Yeah.
this can take another 2 hours of our time together here. But maybe you want to answer that person real quickly, and then we
Sure.
close today.
So first thing is the monad is not a component of our personality. Just to make sure, maybe I wasn't clear.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Okay.
um, the we say that. So think about it this way. First of all, very quickly, we are essences. We are not spirits.
Okay.
The definition of a spirit is something that is non-material and non-physical, plus the perispirit or spiritual body.
Uh-huh.
So a spirit is already a dyad. a two-part being. Let's put it
Yeah.
loosely. Two
Yeah.
part. It's not really parts. Okay? That thing that is non-material, that is non-physical at the same time, we sometimes loosely speaking say call it spirit, but it is
Uh-huh.
not.
Uh-huh.
According to the high order spirits, it is not. So let's call it essence, because essence, quintessence, the Greeks had a word for it,
Uh-huh.
peptousia,
Uh-huh.
that which has no previous origin, the first, peptousia. But for us, let's call it essence.
Uh-huh.
So when the essence sees itself in front of the universal fluid, it manifests itself materially as a perispirit or a spiritual body. It's like when we go in front of the mirror. We are not the mirror. We are not
Uh-huh.
even the air between the mirror and ourselves. But our image in the mirror is our perispirit. If I
Uh-huh.
say hello, the image says hello. The perispirit has no control of itself.
Uh-huh.
Everything it is and does, because now it's material, it also does things. Everything it is and does is from the essence. And the material, the universal fluid, the cosmic fluid, please don't
Uh-huh.
say universal cosmic fluid because it's the same thing. Cosmic
Yes.
is Greek, universal is Latin. So you're just saying twice the same thing. So it's either universal or cosmic. When we, the essence, the non material, non physical, goes in front of it, we are the ones who are everything. For us to do something, we need the material part, not physical, material. That's when we have this image created,
Uh-huh.
and that image we call it perispirit or spiritual body. And then there are the details for the spiritual body, the
I love
gradation.
it.
That's a different story. Get the point here, right? When the essence begins its journey, it's not a spirit. It does not see, when it makes a mirror image,
Uh-huh.
it makes a mirror image that is very, very poor quality, like oh fuzzy, oh irregular, because it is fuzzy, it is irregular, it knows nothing. At
Uh-huh.
that stage, the combination essence
Yeah.
plus the spiritual body, I'll call it
Yeah.
spiritual body,
Yeah.
is called monad,
Yeah.
not spirit.
The
So we
fuzzy
call,
image. Yeah. I
yeah,
love it. I love
we
it.
call essence, and the perispiritual body is called perimonad.
Yeah. Love it. Love it.
As we grow, the monad one day gets promoted to the level of spirit, like an anniversary, like a promotion at work.
Yeah.
And then the essence continues to be essence, but now we change the name of the of the perispiritual body, of the peri body, okay, or that part into
Yes.
perispirit or
Yes.
spiritual body, because now the
Yes.
combination is called spirit. So
Yes.
monad is simply the stage before. That's all.
Yes.
So it has nothing to do with personality.
Yes.
Personality we apply to the physicality when, um, apply to the physicality when we have a human body, for instance, and
So
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 on.
it's a pre-personality, it's
It's a pre-personality.
pre-perispirit, it's pre spirit individuality, right?
If we are
Yeah.
to use the words from Emmanuel, from many different books, from the
Uh,
Book of Hope, from Chico Xavier Responde or Chico Xavier Answers.
uh,
There is also a book from Joanna de Angelis Answers.
yes.
They say that we are in the first grade of our evolution. It's
Ah,
not even. When I tell these things to people, usually at the center, there's always someone who goes up in arms and say, "No, we are not even teenagers." So think about
yes.
it. Monad is our infancy.
Yes.
The
A
like
good
toddlers.
metaphor. Yeah. Yeah.
By the
Yeah.
time we get to toddler to the first, let's say, until we are 11 years old, before the teens,
Yeah.
that's the spirit. And we don't know the angelical states, if it's going, and we don't know.
It's too
So
far from
this is it.
here. Yes. Yeah.
Now back to
Well,
the question.
yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So we we go when we are monads, we There's very little intelligence. So as monads, we interact with everything before being a human being. As monads, we are related, better word, associated to the inanimate matter, to a rock,
Yeah.
where we learn the chemistry of this world, the physics of this world. We are then associated with the very first biological beings, and we learn that things that eventually will become the senses. We learn to sense the environment. We go through the plant world, and we go through the first animals. As we get closer and closer to kingdom animalia, or animals,
Uh-huh.
we are beginning to transform. It's not like an overnight thing. You go to bed one way and you come back, you wake up the other. You don't get to bed monad and you wake up spirit.
Eh,
It's a process, which is
yeah.
why we see some form of intelligence in certain animals. They are in that continuum, and they're very close to us, but not. When we reach the point of inhabiting this physicality, which for us happened about 2.58 million years ago
Uh-huh.
on this planet, then we are called, promoted to the name spirit. That monad is still the same monad, but is now reincarnating, named as spirit. It has the essence, and its essence is now associated to a better spirit, a better peribody, which
Uh-huh.
is now no longer perimonad, but it's called perispirit.
Yeah.
And it can do more with that. By doing more with that, it learns how to use utensils. It learns how to speak. It
Yeah.
learns how to do so many things. It develops intelligence. And with the development of intelligence comes the development of responsibility. And with the development of intelligence and then responsibility, the development, no one has free will. We develop free will. If free will could be had, there would be a supermarket in the spiritual realm. And before incarnating, we'll just go through one of the items. I want this package of free will. And
I love it. No, it doesn't exist.
we create our free will. The more responsibility we have, the more intelligent. And intelligence here is not degrees from university. No, it's spiritual intelligence. The more spiritual intelligence, being intelligence that we create, the more responsibility now we have in our actions, in our speech, in our thoughts, and the more free will we enjoy because we have done our homework to deserve that free will. We built it ourselves. God does not distribute free will,
Uh-huh.
apportion free will. No, we develop it. It's a state of being. Free will is not a property,
Uh-huh.
it's a state of being. It is part of what we are in the essence. I
Absolutely.
am my free will. My free will is the representation of what I am. It is
So it goes
very
back to,
different.
yeah, it goes back to what you said about Eric Fromm, right? And I'm going to share
In a
here
way.
in
Yeah,
case,
in a
yeah,
way.
right, a little bit, right, where you mentioned before the linguistics of to have or to be, right? And
What
not I,
for
yeah,
us it's even more because the free will defines
uh,
me and I define free will. You don't know
yeah,
which one. It's like the chicken and the egg in the joke. You never know which one started the whole
uh-huh,
thing. So
yeah,
I grow to a point where I create the free will for myself. I develop that free will to that point, but that free will is what I am. So really, what really started?
absolutely,
Okay?
absolutely. Julio, this has been a pleasure. I see us coming back to talk about many other topics as babies of today's topics at a later time. But I want to, as before we close today's discussion, if you could perhaps do a prayer and we'll close.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just gonna go back to my presentation.
Sure.
Is yours? I believe you're still seeing it, right? And I
Yes.
have something here. Yes, we calm ourselves at this point. We raise our thoughts in unison as one voice, as one mental voice. to our benefactors, benefactresses, to all the spirits that have assisted us throughout this process in preparing, in delivering, in sending this to the airs, to everyone. We ask them to continue to bless us, to assist us in our journey because there's so much to do. We are capable, we are ready. We just ask that they continue to strengthen and encourage us in our process, in our journey towards plenitude. We also thank everyone who's here. We ask for them to be blessed, protected. The ones who arrived a little late, the ones who will see it in the future. We ask that our week, that our lives be blessed with challenges, with new realities, so that we may strengthen ourselves. We may incorporate new ideas, and with that, take a few more steps towards that plenitude we hear so much about. With this in mind, we ask the permission of our mentors to close this meeting. So be it.
So be it. Thank you, Julio. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next time.